What's up, YouTube? I'm Christophernegroni, and today we're going to take it back. We're going to take it back to the origins of all this craziness. Back to the first watch that really got me into watches. The one that spawned it all. We're talking about the infamous, the legendary, the beloved Seiko SKX007. So I haven't really talked about this watch on the channel, mainly because I don't really wear this watch anymore. I think the last few years, I definitely have gotten a little bit caught up in some of the thrills in chasing these hard to get watches at retail. And I think this has caused me to become a little out of touch. Yeah, I think I've lost touch in what made me fall in love with watches in the first place. And I think I really recognized this right after my last pickup, the Day-Date. This watch was my grail watch, a watch I lusted over for years. Something I didn't think I'd get for a very long time. And the second that I got this watch, I started looking at Royal Oaks. I mean, come on. Now, I think it's a natural progression to start looking at higher tiered watches, but I don't need to take that leap just yet. That was sort of a pump the brakes moment for me. I really needed something to give me perspective, something to ground me and remind me of what made me fall in love with watches. So I dug this bad boy out. I slapped it on my wrist. I wore it for a whole week. And let me tell you, it's done exactly what I needed it to do. It's reminded me exactly what made me fall in love with watches. Why I got into this hobby to begin with. Because it was this watch that started it all. The Seiko SKX007, the gateway drug into the world of mechanical wristwatches. Quick rundown of this watch, because it is a pretty old model now, actually discontinued and no longer sold by Seiko, so maybe you're not familiar with this iconic diver. The Seiko SKX007 was first launched in 1996. It featured a lot of Seiko DNA that enthusiasts had grown very fond of. A printed matte black dial, broad arrow hands. Everything about this watch is built around legibility and usability. With a screw down crown, 200 meters of water resistance, and a fully graduated bezel, this watch meets all of ISO criteria for a certified dive watch. At 42 millimeters in diameter, 13.25 millimeters in height, and a short 46 millimeters lug to lug, the SKX wears beautifully on just about any strap, whether it's a rubber, NATO, or the OEM rattly Jubilee-esque bracelet. It wears so well because of that lug-to-lug and its 4 o'clock crown placement that aids in its wearable, everyday ergonomics. The SKX has always punched way above its weight class, and I suspect it's responsible for many crazy watch enthusiasts today. So what led me into mechanical watches and subsequently the SKX in the first place? Well, rewind to 2016 when I separated from the military. You could say I had a little bit of time on my hand, no pun intended. But right after my separation, I went in to have a little cleanup procedure on my hip. And during my recovery, along with the long list of movies to watch, I had a long list of to-do items to do. One of those to-do items was research and buy a nice watch. This was one of those items that I had put on a list and neglected for so many years. But for men, there's really only a few pieces of jewelry you can wear, a watch being a big one. So I knew for a while I wanted to get one nice watch. And typically when I decide to buy something, I dive pretty deep. I read all the articles, I scour the forums, and of course I watch every video. It was then that I discovered guys like TGV and began reading blogs like Hodinkee. I was hooked from day one. I've always been very nostalgic, and these stories of guys who wore the same watch for 40 years straight, taking it with them all over the world, seeing how they patina and change over time, I was hooked, man. I knew I wanted something like that. I wanted something that would get all scratched up and dinged and tell the story of my life. So fast forward a bit, it was the dive watches that really struck a chord with me. It was the idea that these badass guys that explored the depths of the ocean using mixed gases needed watches that were reliable tools. And it really doesn't take long before you get sucked into Rolex and their role that they had in dive history, and subsequently pop culture following that. Rolex dive watches were always renowned for their robustness, while their design lent themselves to a great everyday wear watch. So easy, buy a Rolex dive watch, right? The problem is that I was just transitioning from active duty military to the private sector and really didn't have the resources or the discretionary income that I have now to just go buy a Rolex dive watch on a whim. So to me, the next best thing to do was buy the Seiko SKX007. To a complete noob, to a complete novice in this hobby, they're the same watch. Oh man, shows how much I knew back then. I would try to rationalize this by saying, you know, they're both dive watches, black dials. They both have rotating bezels. You know, what's the difference? You know, why would you spend $7,500 on one when you could spend $200 on the other? Same difference, right? And listen, I wore this SKX with pride, okay? I took all my wrist shots well before the tattoos. I switched up the straps. I like this watch so much so that the case back on the watch, which features a wave motif, led me to discover an art piece called the Great Wave of Kanakawa. Very similar looking wave. And I actually had it tattooed on my hand. The more you know. The Seiko SKX may lose 30 seconds a day. It will no doubt have a chapter ring that's misaligned and a bezel that's equally misaligned. It's gonna have the most rattly Jubilee-esque bracelet, something that looks like a Rolex Jubilee, but 100 years later. Look at that. But what it lacks in refinement, it makes up with character. The bezel can age naturally and fade to a beautiful ghost-like effect. The red text on the dial can turn more orange. This dive watch has managed to capture the hearts of some of the biggest watch collectors. I will always keep this watch nearby to ground me in this watch collecting journey. And it's crazy to think today that I would go on to buy and own many Rolex dive watches. So I think it was important to take a moment and honor this watch. Wear it for a week and just take a moment and reflect on how far I've come in the hobby. And just remind myself what I love about watches. You know, it's not about the watch. It's about the journey. It's about collecting memories with these little things. So there she is, the watch that got me into watches. Tell me what got you into watches. What was your gateway drug? I know it's not a Rolex, it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I love this little thing. Thanks for watching. Negroni out!